Thank you for your kind invitation. Actually, I focus on languages, ancient languages, and the relationship between different languages like Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Syriac in the past, and also how words are explained and received by religious traditions. That's my focus. So I focus on lexicographical issues and how they are used in reading different texts for different purposes. So the title of my talk is Semantics of Interaction Between Historical Knowledge and Spirituality. I saw I have 50 minutes, and I thought I will spend maybe 25 to 30 minutes for my talk to leave room for discussion. So in approaching the relationship of spirituality and history, a fundamental factor is how we view the importance of history itself. The reason why I'm calling it a fundamental factor is because many spiritual movements or religious traditions use data from history or tradition to describe their existential orientation. For some people, history signifies the past. It means a set of events not really relevant for the future, also because this set of events is easily seen from the historiographical rather than philosophy of history point of view. Tradition, religious and moral values, political institutions, spiritualities, nations, customs, and the like. A number of circumstances and formative events that in one way or another have been affecting our present state. Tradition understood as a conservative force from which one should be freed. And the past-present direction where history possesses directionality, for example, Christian theological, spiritual, religious arguments, inspiration, revelation, incarnation, and salvation. So although both history and spirituality want to answer why, how, and what questions, the putting together of meanings of historical actions often radically differ. For example, some approaches to history are hermeneutic in the sense where they are focused on interpretation of large historical events or figures rather than the interpretation of individual smaller events or words. In such an environment, the reader of the events will assign meanings to some elements of the story in order to fit these elements into his larger picture or religious tradition. This is visible, for example, in dogma making, theological traditions, specific readings of particular biblical verses, etc. So the aim of my talk is to highlight levels of data usage and readings of texts and how to distinguish between data themselves and their place within a particular argument, religious, spiritual, and the like. Rather than offering black or white solutions, my wish is to highlight some issues involved in attempts at understanding the interaction between historical knowledge and one acquires using certain methods and spirituality. This being a large topic, I shall speak from the perspective of my research in which I focus on Syriac biblical narratives and translations and their relationship to the Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew heritage. I also think all of these issues and questions I'm going to highlight might be transferred to other academic disciplines. So the historical knowledge from the title of my talk is understood as collecting archival data, facts, informations, and skills put all together, and topic history making, while spirituality is used to refer to the values and meanings by which people seek to understand their existence in order to achieve full potential in the broadest sense of the term, by using or reading such data. I have chosen the word semantics because it encompasses sense, reference, presupposition, implication, word meanings, and relations between them. Interaction is used to illustrate how spirituality reads through and uses historical knowledge and textual evidence, Bible, Quran, Vedas, Sutras, etc., to nourish experiences of its followers. In this respect, three questions stand out in particular. First, to what extent meanings reflect the interaction between different knowledges or traditions from the past? Second, how to combine collecting data, intellectual honesty, philosophical or theological method, doctrine, and spirituality or piety. Third, how is a traditional believer to give thanks to God for God's help in the past regarding a host of historical events recorded in the Bible if he thinks they did not happen or did not happen as depicted? For example, in Numbers 15, we read, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. In 1 Chronicles, we read about the covenant God made with Abraham, promised it to Isaac, and confirmed it to Jacob. In Psalms, we read, I am the Lord your God who brought you up from the land of Egypt. So since the period after the Jesus Christ event is often described as a formative moment of Christian identity, I shall concentrate more on that period because it is a good example of studying two crucial aspects of interaction between historical knowledge and spirituality. Formative moments, for example, the relationship between the time immemorial and real history. We have it everywhere. Aburbe Condita, 753, the first Olympiad, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad. So each nation, religion has a kind of formative moment they start, from which they start understanding the history in more serious sense, so to say. As well as the relationship between hagiography and history. So formative moments. Concerning the so-called formative moments, several questions arise. How to organize into an intelligible pattern what is otherwise a series of unrelated moments, scarcity of sources, and so on. To what extent it is possible to identify the relationship between texts, their contexts, and audience. So for whom these texts or traditions are written or orally transmitted. Because we often forget that we also have oral traditions, not only written traditions. How far one can go in identifying the background of the people involved in forming any kind of texts. One author or a group of authors, translators, copyists, tradition of reading, so on. To what extent it is possible to move beyond mere resemblances between text, history, and spirituality, and to determine to which degree the interrelationship between historical, cultural, theological, and spiritual identities is relevant. Is it possible to use textual evidence of just one genre as a valid tool for evaluating historical events? For example, Bible as a religious text, as it is understood today. If one succeeds in demonstrating a close link between different texts, periods, and tradition, what evidence can be found in order to ascertain the direction of such a relationship? So these questions can be illustrated by several examples from ancient history and chronography writing. For example, for Julius Africanus, 2nd to 3rd century, in his Chronographiae, historical meaning is not in the content of the events described or in their relationship to one another, but rather in their succession and chronological scope from his point of view. George Syncellus, 8th to 9th century, in his Ecloge Chronographias, like many other Byzantine chronographers, is more concerned with compiling sources than analyzing them. Lactantius claims, Lactantius from the 3rd century, we whom the sacred scriptures instruct to the knowledge of truth know the beginning and the end of the world. God completed the world and this admirable work of nature in the space of 6 days, as is contained in the secrets of Holy Scripture. So when a Christian chronographer from late antiquity, for example, consulted extra-biblical sources to supplement Genesis, because that Genesis is just, if you look at the text itself, it's a story of several people, and if you reduce religious traditions from Genesis, you don't find a lot of things from, it's not very informative in a way. So they consulted extra-biblical sources to supplement Genesis, be it the Jewish apocalypse, such as the Book of Enoch, or the Antiquities of Manetho. He wanted either to find in these works independent corroboration for Genesis, or to enlarge on matters that Genesis left ambiguous or unsettled altogether. We find it, for example, in Syriac tradition, because if you read Genesis 22, you don't find Sarah, Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac, but where is the mother? Who asked the mother whether she agrees that the son should be sacrificed? So you have, in the literature, in the ancient literature, you have a lot of expansions on this story to fill the gap. I shall try to illustrate the above-mentioned issues in 3 steps. First, three corpora in which a certain relationship between historical knowledge and spirituality can be traced. First, biblical translations. B, second, rewritten Bible. And C, third, native literature. I focus on them since they point to the complexity of understanding internal evidences, the relationship between synchronicity and diachronicity, translation and transmission techniques, and spiritual creativity of literary genres. The first, biblical translations. The biblical translations reflect multivalent textual constructions as well as hermeneutics of their translators. In that sense, one can say that they do not always provide a translation of a biblical text in a strict sense of the word, but also point to the understanding of described events and figures by a particular group of translators, or one translator. Therefore, translations of a biblical text necessarily need to be studied within their historical milieu and theological usage, event plus value plus meaning. Biblical versions are topoi, places, to see how theological, religious, or spiritual approaches to text can affect conclusions about events from the past. They also reflect theological understanding of a particular passage, interaction with other reading traditions, for example, Jewish Christian or Christian Muslim, and the process of their production, which can be found in the manuscript tradition. You have Eastern traditions, Western traditions, and so on. So although textual parallels are more or less easily traceable, it is not an easy task to identify a deeper relationship between different traditions of their usage. On that basis, there are several points concerning methodology used in the process of identification the net of relationships. First, a reading of the, for example, Old Testament versions and translations in their integrity suggests that the process of their development was complex. Namely, for the case for example, Syriac Old Testament, the internal evidence and differences in translation technique which emerge between different books show that the translation technique was drawn from Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Mesopotamian heritage sometimes. We often forget that the Bible is the canonical title, so to say. So it's a collection of different books with different linguistic styles. They cover a span of almost more than 1,000 years of history. But we have, for example, a dictionary of biblical Hebrew or biblical Greek covering the whole thing. Imagine translating Shakespeare with the dictionary used in the 21st century and projecting definitions from our modern dictionaries onto ancient texts. That's what we often do when we read ancient texts. So we should put the text into the context. It's very hard, especially when we have issues between so-called standard language and dialects and so on. It's very dangerous sometimes. One should be careful. So one can conclude that Syriac versions of biblical texts, or any other ancient versions, demonstrate links with both early traditions of Christianity and Judaism, and the nature of those links becomes a central point in identifying its reading of history, exegesis, and spirituality. The problem of providing certainty in conclusions is represented by the complexity of the text itself, phenomena of, for example, metathesis and polygenesis. For example, when you look at the Septuagint, you will find sometimes translations that are 100% different from the Hebrew version of the same verse. One can start by considering the translator's values and meanings, then moving to the evidence for the historical setting of the version in order to suggest a theological or spiritual coloring of a particular text. Such a reconstruction would contain specific aspects of the biblical narrative containing specific interests in practices of worship, prayer, faith, sacrifice, priesthood, etc. An example. When you look at Book of Numbers, Leviticus, you'll find a detailed descriptions of what is pure, what is impure. And when you look at the ancient translations of a specific rabbinic technical terminology from Mishnah and from rabbinic tradition, if someone says, okay, this book was translated by early Jews or early rabbis, and then you look, okay, fine, but the translation doesn't really reflect your conclusions because the translation is not very careful about the technical terminology of the same period. So you start asking questions, who actually translated the text? And then you see how the texts are important to make conclusions about identities, cultures, and religions from the past, and about spiritual usage of the text. Because rabbis of that period would not be uncareful about certain terms and terminology used in specific books. So there are many questions to ask. Second, since the aims of ancient translations are maybe, what to say, fidelity or something like that, to both the source and the target text and tradition, the complexity in identifying the relationship between the source and the target version is connected with the translation technique and spiritual tradition, which in its own right represent a couple of issues. As I said, usage of the Hebrew or Greek text, defining the Vorlage, imitation of the form of the Hebrew, Greek, or other versions, or loan words, consistency of equivalences, changes in meanings, etc. For example, in one of the translations, John the Baptist did not eat locusts, but rather a kind of grass. The translation was adapted to local ascetic practices that could not accept that John the Baptist ate meat. Third, semantic relationship between textual data can point to common traditions relating both to the meaning of the Hebrew and to the choice of words in, for example, Aramaic, Syriac, or Greek, to render particular words of praise or phrases. There are 4 different categories which point to such a complexity. Passages where the version simply follows the whole or part of another source or tradition. Passages where a biblical translation exhibits external characteristics which are not present in the source text. Passages where the translation attests an interpretative tradition, for example, Midrash. Passages where a specific version has no direct parallel in other sources, but which may nevertheless still be of their origin. Here you can highlight the relationship between different religious traditions, for example, early Judaism or early Christianity. Fourth, one is confronted with the question how far one can go in identifying the identity of translator of a particular biblical translation. It should be kept in mind that the significance of a variant reading in the process of transmission is different from its significance in the process of translation. The first represents the mechanical phenomenon, and the second is concerned with matters of content and meaning. This case is another example which demonstrates how the defining the process of establishing a particular text influences conclusions about its historical origins and spiritual color, or religious, Jewish, rabbinic, non-rabbinic, Judeo-Christian, Christian, and the like, or none of those. Second, a rewritten Bible. Concerning the rewritten Bible, there are 4 aspects to be taken into account. First, they are not considered as source texts in the same sense as the biblical text is. Second, comparing textual historical data is even more complex. Third, resource and quantity. For example, how much evidence we have and from where. Sometimes historians or readers of the past find a fragment about something, 3 lines, and they make a big picture about the event or about the whole century, but it might be just a random inscription somewhere. We witness it very often. And fourth, structuring the data process. This is, for example, the case with the Syriac tradition of Joseph and Asenath, which presumably was translated in the early 6th century by Moses of Agel from a Greek manuscript. Similar phenomena can also be found in the books of like Enoch and Jubilees, of which a textual evidence in Syriac is not entirely extant. So these cases point to the issue that although the analogies and similarities are demonstrable on the textual level, it is hard to trace the origins of the relationship. Later commentators often fill the gap in the source text with their contemporary beliefs, as we do it today as well. We read the Bible in the Catholic tradition, the Orthodox tradition, or Protestant tradition, but it doesn't mean that the way you read Genesis is the way you should read it from a historical point of view or from the point of view of the translator or composer of such a text. In this respect, one of the major issues is determining the date of a particular work reached a particular historical identity. For example, the date of some Syriac translations of Jewish pseudepigrapha, such as the Songs of Solomon, excerpts from the Testament of Adam and the lives of prophets, as well as the Apocalypse of Daniel, are completely untraceable. Because of the lack of the historical evidence, it is difficult to determine where did the process start and how. In the cases where the names of the translators are known, the first task is to identify whether it was a real author of a particular text, or it is a later attribution because of spiritual or other importance of a particular figure or narrative. Another thing we often do, because we have certain practices in reading biographies or writing data, and our understanding of authorship sometimes differ very radically from the authorship understanding of authors in the past. So when you say, for example, John, Moses, or something like that, it doesn't mean it should be understood in the same way as you say, for example, Jean-Paul Sartre or Kant or someone else. And you can say, oh, they wrote this work this year, this period of time was motivated by this and this and this. We try to do the same with ancient texts, but we don't have enough data for that. And we often project our traditions onto this kind of authorship. One of the texts which can well illustrate these issues is The Cave of Treasures, a Christianized retelling of the Bible from the 1st century. Third, native Syriac literature, or native literature in general. The scholarship commonly suggests that early writers such as Ephrahat and Ephraim share exegetical traditions with Jewish sources. Christians sharing Jewish sources. Imagine today someone saying he is a Christian reading, using Quran or using Islamic tradition. But we do the same for the past. But when a good Catholic, so to say, says, I'm reading the Quran to inspire my Christianity, you would say, how is it possible to do that? But for the past, we do it very easily, especially when it comes to Judaism. This claim is connected with three crucial aspects of the history of Syriac biblical exegesis: the origin of Syriac Christianity, formative periods, first translations of biblical texts into Syriac and Aramaic, and spiritual traditions from different periods. I mentioned earlier the genre question. Defining of genre is another question we should ask the people who study literature. When you say poetry or prose, in today's understanding, it doesn't mean that the prose or poetry were the same, understood in the same way 1,000 years ago or something like that. So, considering that question, for example, Commentary on Genesis by Ephraim, which is the longest of his authentic exegetical works, uses biblical narratives differently from his verse homilies and the hymns. The main difference between them consists in the phenomenon that the Commentary on Genesis stays within the framework of the biblical version itself and is written in prose, whilst in the verse homilies and hymns take scriptural passages from throughout the Bible and decontextualize them in order to accentuate the typological, symbolical, and spiritual meanings. And those are written mainly in poetry. I'll offer some conclusions now. We have seen that the gaps in the historical evidence highlight the need for well-controlled studies that combine different disciplines and questions. This consists of an interrelationship between the identification of parallels and the origins of the influence, as well as different aspects of methodological problems which arise from the very nature of the content of a particular genre. Internal evidences of the texts, translation and transmission techniques, and the creativity of authors. In the case of biblical translations, we have seen that identifying data is connected with the translation interpretation technique, which in its own right deals with several issues: perception of the source text, rewriting the source text for spiritual purposes, oral traditions, loanwords, consistency of equivalences and textual expansions, and relationship to other languages and traditions. Concerning the written Bible and native Syriac literature, we have seen that there are several issues one has to deal with. Linguistic stylistic changes, harmonizations, lexicographical issues, historico-exegetical changes, contextual, spiritual, and theological changes, variant readings and additions to the body of the text where content alterations are often secondary. Modern scholars move beyond exclusively historical critical approaches, focusing on writers and translators as authors with theological, spiritual, and other agendas pursued by various strategies. Although we are not able to offer very precise conclusions and methods how to proceed in studying the relationship between history and spirituality, we can at least keep learning how to be more and more careful in studying and structuring the data, identifying their historical and spiritual contexts, recognizing a distinction between the objectivity of past events, actions, and circumstances, their presence in modern observation and religious traditions, of objectivity of past events, and so-called big pictures used for religious and spiritual purposes. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koralija, for your very interesting and inspiring talk. I think we have like 15 minutes for questions. Any questions?
I also thank you very much for this profound and intriguing presentation. I'm more familiar with the Greek transmission of texts. And when we look at 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, very often many of the manuscripts adapt to the dogmatic changes. Where there are some councils, then often even the Gospels, there are some sentences, some formulations that are kind of adapting the dogmatic worldview, so to say. We also know that some political, not just spiritual, influences make difference or change texts. When we talk about Syriac Christianity in that formative, we often hear that this is an ascetic kind of type of Christianity. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what exactly the Syriac Christians were looking for? Maybe it's just more examples that I'm looking for, because often the story goes that Syriac Christians are not overburdened with Greek philosophy, so they're more in connection to the Semitic Jewish culture in that interaction. I guess I'm just looking for more examples.
I see what you mean.
Well, yeah. Thank you
very much. I'll explain it in 2 steps. First, I've chosen this Syriac topic because it's very interesting for many reasons, historical, graphical, chronological reasons, especially because it's a Christianity outside the Roman Empire and outside Eusebius' understanding of Eukumene. For example, in his history, he will not explain things that happen outside the Roman Empire, but because for him, Eukumene is the Roman Empire. He will just put the correspondence, written correspondence between Jesus and King Abgar, which is a legend, but it's in his history. Second, these issues are not only present in religious traditions. We have to say, and I often say to philosophers and politicians, you all also have traditions of reading different philosophers. St. Thomas Aquinas was not a Thomist, Marx was not a Marxist, Hegel was not a Hegelian. So we should make these distinctions. So it happens everywhere, not only in religions. You have to be honest about that. For the Syriac tradition, it depends where you look at and to which period you focus on. What is crucial, I think, in your question is the distinction between the so-called Semitic or prophetic understanding of truth. Here we enter into the different definitions of truth. So how you say something is true or false in the Greek tradition, in the Semitic tradition. Do they have syllogisms? So how do they conclude about events if they are not of the Greek tradition? Atheists or certain atheistic traditions will say this is not consistent because in the Bible you see this and this and this. But then I ask a question back, say, okay, fine, but how would you expect Moses to follow your syllogism or logical fallacies? They didn't have logical fallacies. The idea of a straw man or whatever, you know, it's also a kind of a projection onto ancient texts. So, but in general, what I can say for the Syriac tradition is that intellectual activity is connected with the existential understanding of your spiritual life and of your everyday life. So obviously they distinguished in their way between how to write and how to explain things and how to practice them. But the line between is different. I wouldn't say it doesn't exist, but it's very different from the line we put between intellectual activity or reasoning and practice and spiritual tradition. A third point, I think, which is important here is sometimes the people think if you discover something that is not in your dogma or religious tradition, it affects your faith or you lose your faith. I don't think so, because if you are good in historical method and in methods and scientific method in empirical methods, and if you know and if you like your religious tradition, I don't think you would lose your faith just because you learned that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, or if you learned that in Isaiah 7:14 the Greek understanding of the Virgin is not the same understanding as it is in the Hebrew Bible. So then you enter into lexicographical issue of understanding what is Parthenos and what is Betullah. What does it mean? Does it mean that they didn't have sexual interrelationships, or does it mean something else? So but your religious tradition builds beliefs on a certain tradition of reading, and this is legitimate. I mean, we have different traditions of readings, but we shouldn't project our tradition of religious reading onto other disciplines, and you can't affect, for example, linguistics or language understanding by your own tradition. Then you have a confessional dictionaries. If you do that, then you write it. You write theological or Catholic dictionary of the Hebrew Bible, and everyone will know which method you use. But it's legitimate as well, so I like it, in a way.
Professor Krajewski.
I have a general question. There is a distinction between looking at the ancient texts from the, say, scientific point of view, as I understand you do, and looking at them as sources of your own religious or spiritual involvement. From the latter point of view, there is some core message that is transmitted even if the text was written, thousands of years ago. My question is whether, do you think that, or do you believe that from the scientific, perspective, you can retain the core message, or it's not really possible because there are the changes of the culture, understanding, and the meanings of the terms and associations are so radical that after thousands of years, the text means something completely different.
Yeah. It's very easy and very hard question at the same time. First, it's a question of semantics. Cognitive linguistics can help, especially for abstract terms like goodness, beauty, behavior. When you look at the text by a certain author that says you should behave this and this and this and this and this and this and that way, if you're not familiar with his language and the language of his time, or maybe of the language of the redaction of this text, because if it says the text was written by a certain John, it doesn't mean that the text you have is by John. It might have been redacted by the people 300 years after him. It is possible, and the people spend a lot of time studying one word. It depends. You can spend 4 or 5 years studying just one word in Greek or just one word in Hebrew and trying to clean somehow your reception with the core message, which is called Horizontverschmelzung in philosophical theory by certain philosophers. So what's the difference? You have the text, and you have the aim of the text, the aim of the author, and they have the reception and all these kind of things around. It is possible by, I think, those who do it professional or professors have a big responsibility in making it simple to the students and to the other people. I mean, we can't expect from everyone to read academic articles or high-level researchers. But what we can do, we can read seriously studies and to see how, for example, colors, does the color red means red in our sense, or it means something else 2,000 years ago. When you say a table, does it mean that the table looked like we have it today, or it looked in a different way? It sounds simple, but when you put all these things together, the message you read can change the meaning completely by the understanding of the terminology. So, and it's also problematic when you say scientific. I think you always have a kind of presupposition or Vorverständnis, presuppositions. So how do you approach and which method you use? I think in the science can be very religious in a way, and some people can't jump from one method into another. Some people are very slaves of one method, and they are religious in their scientific tradition. In the same way, we are religious in Catholic or Protestant tradition. But also, why? It's a question of prudence as well. For example, you can't, if you meet someone who is a Muslim or Jew, who doesn't know these languages, if he reads Augustine or he reads Mishnah or different texts in his religious way, for his religious purpose, even projecting his modern understandings to nourish his faith, I don't think it's false from his spiritual perspective. And you can't say, no, it's false, it's false. It's a question of prudence. Then you are not prudent by saying that, because he's not ready for questions. I mean, the people, that's why I'm saying those who do these things professionally should do it very well, at the very high, they should be the most serious, as serious as possible in their research, in order to make these complex messages simple without affecting the core research and scientific method, if you see what I mean. Yeah, I think that's the way we can do that. And we should do that.
I think we have a time for one more question.
I have a lot of questions to myself. I think I had a list of 20 questions at least in this paper.
Can we have your answer to the first question on your list?
Yeah,
What's
maybe that would be a good idea.
What's the first question? Wait. Maybe not the first. Yeah. Yeah, that's a... Concerning the so-called formative moments, several questions arise. First, how to organize into an intelligible pattern what is otherwise a series of unrelated moments, scarcity of sources, and so on. This is a good point. Yeah, because let's say some people try to understand the early Islam and the formation of the Quran, of the text as we have it now, as we have received it now. And one person argued that the word for God or Allah, obviously Allah is not only a Muslim way of saying God, it's an Arabic language, so it's used by Christians and everything. But it's very interesting how scholars sometimes use a random inscription from the 4th or 5th century from Saudi Arabia, epigraphic inscription that says something similar to that, not really Allah, but there is a certain word that can be understood if you want to read it that way as Allah, and they conclude, aha, we have Allah even before the Islam, and therefore it must be a Christian, something like that. You can do that, but there's a question then about the history of language, the phonology, how the question changes, how the pronunciation changes. You have a lot of questions. So unrelated moments like the Quran and this epigraphical or whatever inscriptions can be joined together for your religious purposes, but then I will ask you a lot of problematic questions you might not be able to answer. That's because the first question I would ask, and I asked the person, is how do you know that the language didn't change? Because when was the first Arabic grammar written? Who are the speakers? Do you believe in standard classical language? I don't believe that there is kind of standard Greek or standard Arabic. Because in the Septuagint language, the Septuagint uses the Hellenistic Greek, so to say. But sometimes, if you look at the classical Greek dictionaries or classical Greek texts, some verbs go with accusative, and suddenly they change. They start being used with dative. So why and how it happened? You must study the text to know that. So the Septuagint is Greek, but you can't use the classical Greek dictionary to read the Septuagint because your conclusions about the text and your translation will be false. So you have a lot of levels, but yeah, thank you for your question.
Thank you very much for all of those questions, especially for the last one, which was really interesting, and for a very inspiring talk. Thank you again, Dr. Koralija.